of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Hello.
Hey, hi.
Hey.
Okay, this is Arlene.
This is Gowri.
And I'm Asmod.
Finally, he's back.
Finally, our Asmod, which is our intern from Nepal, he recently had a very interesting trip outside of Malaysia to Indonesia
And you
and
know
also
what's interesting
Singapore.
about that?
What is
Yesterday
it?
when he came back, he said, "This feels like home, Malaysia." And I was like, "Yeah."
So anyway, we are glad to have you here, Asmod, together to discuss on today's topic, which is actually a very important global issue right now, which is the Palestinian and Israeli war, which is happening currently in Gaza Strip, situated in the Middle East. So before we start with our discussion today, I guess we need to update about what is the recent events that is happening right now. So far, the death toll has risen up until 400 people, and a lot of them are not just people, the Hamas military supporters or men, but majority of them, interestingly, are families, women and children, and they died because of either bombings or the military tanks, the Israeli military tanks, which has just penetrated the Gaza Strip probably a couple of days ago.
And this Operation Protective Age started on July 8th this year, on 2014, and Israel has called as much as 40,000 reservists and 1,500 soldiers around the perimeter of Gaza for this operation.
So I guess Gowri, why do you think this is a huge problem that the global society needs to focus on?
Well, first of all, this is a conflict that goes back to the 1800s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I was listening to a lecture yesterday from the University of Cleveland by Alison Weir, and she was giving a very good historical introduction or historical perspective to the matter. And it is not actually a very complicated conflict. It's just really complicated to address and really complicated to solve. And of course, a lot of people are dying and getting hurt in the process. So it would be ideal to come up with a solution as quick as possible. But so far, we haven't, I guess they haven't reached a solid plan yet. So it seems that, I guess we all know the story, you know, but then it also goes back to the media bias, which we will cover much later. But for Malaysia, right now, we are, of course, supporting Palestine. And I think it's not just about a Malaysian thing. It's also just being a human. It's a humanistic thing as well. That there are a lot of people dying. It doesn't matter for me who attacked who first. The fact that now is that a lot of people are dying in Palestine, and most of them are innocent kids, and that just needs to stop right away.
Well, to put things into context, of course, this is not just an Israeli offense towards Gaza. I mean, we have to put in mind Hamas was the one who sort of started this counter reaction by Israeli. Although, I mean, there's a valid reason to say that Hamas was just doing its job, you know, to protect the people of Gaza. But in a way, I think it started way back a couple of months ago when one Palestinian boy was killed by Israeli soldier, and he was forced to swallow petrol, if I'm not mistaken, and then he was burned to death, and it got the whole people in Gaza Strip angered, and subsequently 3 Israeli boys were killed as well, I think in retaliation. Afterwards, it suddenly become a war between Israel and also Hamas. A lot of people need to realize that not every Palestinian in Gaza Strip support Hamas. Although Hamas is currently the main offensive force that is working against against Israeli people. And to put into context, Hamas also has been putting on rockets to and pointing it towards Israel. I think they have put a lot of rockets so far, but at the same time, none of his rockets actually kill any Israeli civilians. Actually, none of his rockets even has even penetrate the airspace of Israel, because to put into context as well, Israel is a very technologically savvy country. So in that sense, Israel has somehow managed to use its technological advancement to defuse the bomb before it even reached Israel. So I think that's the part where, if you're talking about proportionality, Israel has been bombing the Gaza Strip, I think more than 100 to 200 bombs, and has been targeting mainly civilian areas. Apparently, they said that Hamas bases are in among civilians, but it's still not a justification to bomb civilian areas just because of the rockets fired by Hamas, which didn't even hit Israel after all.
And the rhetorics of, say, Western government and even Israel is that, hey, Hamas started all the fighting, and that has been the rhetorics even in the past for all the conflicts that has happened maybe in the last decade or so. So whenever the conflicts happen, and it seems the death toll on Palestinian side is really like huge on proportion to what happens in Israel, and mostly the people who are killed in Israel are civilians. But the problem here is Hamas not just has say conflict with Israel, but even in Palestine, it also has conflict with the other major political party there, Fatah. So it has, I think, like while trying to engage like both
you're
within
talking
the country.
about the West Bank, right?
Yeah. So it's a very complex situation. Like, say, it doesn't have a full-scale support of even the Palestinians, and even people in the West Gaza, as you mentioned, like they are not all supporters of Hamas. So the action of one political party, one group, like it affects all the people now in Gaza, and it's saddening to hear that so many lives are being taken. And now I think UN, US are trying to break a truce between Hamas and Israel, but it seems so far Israel isn't ready to give up on the war.
Apparently, I think what I see in the Israeli and Palestine war is the reaction among society. Of course, Islamic society were among the first to strongly react upon what is happening there. I think Malaysia and Indonesia, we produce statements of disagreement towards what Israeli is doing right now. But also at the same time, what I find it to be interesting, a lot of the countries that you won't really suspect it to be pro-Palestinian were actually quite vocal. For example, the British Secretary of State were very much vocal. Foreign Secretary of State were very much vocal against what Israeli was doing, as well as countries in the Latin America, for example, Chile. They actually voiced it out in the Chilean parliament regarding on the issue of what is happening in the Gaza Strips. But also interestingly as well, Obama also have been voicing out his disagreement, although he wasn't being that as vocal in comparison to his disagreement towards Russia or Putin regarding on the MH17. But we can see like there's a growing intensity among the global community that the war in Gaza is not a favorable war or justified war for Israel. It's actually has caused a lot of humanity loss in the process. But what I find it to be even more interesting is so far I haven't heard any of the countries in the Middle East, especially in the Arab among those countries who is part of the Arab League, actually voicing up themselves against the conducts of the Israeli.
And recently, I think Qatar signed a military deal with US to buy its fighter jets, Apache helicopters, worth $11 billion. So the many countries in the Middle East which are allied to US, including Israel, they are trying to boost up their security measures. And you mentioned previously, and it's because of that Israel has been able to shield its population from the rocket attacks, because it has so sophisticated military, and it's largely the credit largely goes to its partnership with the US and the US support. And when you talk about international reactions, even the UN, yeah, Ban Ki-moon is asking the responsible parties to come to a truce, but even then, Western leaders are not so vocal about the condemnation of Israel attack. They are being very diplomatic about how they address the issue.
It's not like when they were complaining against what is happening in Russia, in Ukraine regarding on the MH17. I think they were much more vocal.
Yeah. But in this case, people are clearly taking sides. And even when you talk about media and how they present news, it's very evident that people are very divided. People are very divided in this situation, and like seeing the history and the complexity of the situation, it's reasonable to assume that this war is not gonna be a definite end to the problems that has taken so long to ferment.
What do you think, Gowri?
I have a couple of opinions from ministers and spokesperson. I guess I'll start with Obama first, but we do know that US is actually a bit biased in the sense, even when they are reporting their news, they only focus on Israel.
Yeah, I think we need to have like a variety of media to get like a clear picture of what's happening in that area.
Because if you look up at the US newspapers, they only report the casualties in Israel and not actually in Gaza.
They even downplay the language. Like I can see that when they describe about the MH17, they use like language that have emotional
and like certain words,
impact,
the choice of words they use as well.
But when it comes to the death in Gaza Street, they call it casualties or collateral damage. Like that has no emotional impact at all when you use those kind of words.
Like even the German foreign minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said that the missile attack on Israel from the Gaza Strip has created a situation which threatens the spiraling process of violence and violent countermeasures. And they also go on to say that Israel has the right to protect its citizens from rocket attacks. So going to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that, of course, Ban Ki-moon condemns the recent multiple rocket attacks on Israel from Gaza, and this indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas must stop, like what you mentioned earlier about that it doesn't justify attacking the area with civilians just because that's where your target is located.
So in your perspective, Gowri, do you think the Israeli attacks is justified because they need to protect themselves or their citizens?
I think it's totally okay to protect yourself, but I do think that they are going a bit too far with this, because we know that the Palestinians armor and their paraphernalia is not as advanced as good as the ones that the Israelis have. They have much more advanced technology and all. So yeah, I would say that it's probably both sides' fault, because Hamas launched all these missiles and rockets, and it's natural for another country to retaliate. But I do think that Israel is going a bit too far with this.
And what I find it interesting is when it comes to the way people see the Palestinians, the Palestinian, I would say, refugee or victims, is they see them as if they are either pro Hamas, or they are just clueless people. But actually, in reality, all they want is to have a land to live on, like a shelter, like a home. That's it.
Who, the Palestinians?
The Palestinians.
Okay.
I mean, they are also caught in between. We all know that historically, even Hamas and Fatah don't go. I don't have. Don't
Don't s-
don't see eye and
to
eye,
eye.
eye to eye to each
Yeah.
other. And it happened, I think, in a couple of years before this, where they actually fight with each other, like who should gain control. Of course, eventually Fatah regime gained control in the West Bank, and I think the West Bank is in a state of stability right now. They did voice up against the reaction of Hamas. The reaction of Israeli, but at the same time they weren't that vocal as well. They were like, okay, we just want to take care of our West Bank, and Gaza Strip is Gaza Strip. But in reality, Gaza Strip, even though without the retaliation from Israeli, is still a very much uh, a country that is or an area that is very much controlled by Israel, as in like the natural resources, the water, and also in terms of the economic development of the area as well. The reason I know about this because I do have a friend who is living in who has his family living in Gaza. Currently, he is studying in Malaysia, and he explained to me that you can't even study, for example, chemical engineering. He said that these are the courses that Palestinian kids are barred from studying because the Israelis scared that they will learn the ways how to make bombs, which is irrelevant at all. Like, how can you be barred from acquiring a knowledge just because you might be a threat to Israel?
It sounds like the story of Malala in this case.
Yeah.
Talking about like personal stories, there's a really great opinion article in Al Jazeera. It's called Gaza, a Human Tragedy, and basically the author Sarah Ali, she writes that okay, like it's 3 a.m. in the morning and she's woken up by a bomb cell, and she very touchingly says what it's like to face like to have bomb cells in your home, leave home without like just leave everything out there and not knowing you probably when you're gonna die. And this is the story in Al Jazeera. There's also another article here written by an ex-Princeton professor Richard Falk, and what he basically tells is that okay, would one of the non-Western ally have done the same thing as Israel is doing to Palestine? How the Western countries react? Say, wouldn't they take them to like International Criminal Court?
Of course they they would in any way.
But in this case, nobody has even like talked about the atrocities and what it has been doing. Say when the cases erupt in case what the professor says, they took like Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi. We have all seen what has happened to them, and the reason that U.S. attacked in Iraq was for the so-called weapon of mass destruction, which even didn't exist. Although that doesn't negate the fact that he used like he killed so much of his people. Yeah, the atrocities were still there, but like so far maybe more than 600 people have been killed in Gaza, and 75% of them are civilians. But here's where it gets interesting. Say if you are a BBC fan and if you go there, this article is Gaza, how Hamas tunnel network grew, and Israel is now launching a ground offensive to mainly focusing on, and its rhetoric is it wants to destroy the tunnel network. So the Western media on one hand is starkly divided. Say one group of media, they focus more on the issues from Israeli perspective, and the other from say Palestinian and perspective of the people in general. Both sides have merits, but it's also a very complex issue about power dynamics and how the world basically works, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and I want to add more on that. How can you justify a bombing? Just say that, but we give the warning to the civilians before we planted the bomb. But you have to realize the warning is just a 3-minute warning. Yeah, to get out from the building and to the street, it will probably take more than 3 minutes.
It actually reminds me to an incident that we had last year in here.
Uh-huh.
Remember when they were going to let out the water from the dam
Uh-huh.
in Genting Highlands, I think? And then they gave everyone like 3-minute warning. Like, okay, guys, we're gonna open the dam now. The whole area is gonna be flooded, and you only have 3 minutes to evacuate. So
That's
there was a
just
massive.
insanely crazy justification for bombing, and it's for saying that they are the one who don't want to get out from their house. But you cannot blame them for not getting out of their home. It's their home, and some more 3-minute warning. Are you kidding me? And another thing that I think Israeli is quite smart in a way, comparison to Hamas, is the way they package their story in the media, especially in the Western media. But although there's a saying that they are probably losing the media war, what is being reported in one of the article that I'm looking right now, CS Monitor, Hamas is using human shield to blame for Gaza's toll. So they are trying to repackage the news to make it see like, hey, it's not our fault for bombing these civilians.
That
It's
is just
Hamas who's the one who
crazy.
is using them as a human shield. But if you look at, there's a map that I saw, the areas that were being bombed is actually quite a wide area, and apparently it just bombed everywhere. Like, how can you say that they use human shield when they actually target like the houses of people? Like, there's this one story of a family who has 2 disabled child. All of them were killed just like that.
There might be some merits in saying that Hamas might have had used human shields because it's a war, and like both sides have like done mistakes and done atrocities, on their side, say like bombing another country and trying to kill civilians. Maybe that's a no-no, right? But Israel, on the other hand, is also bombing homes. As I mentioned in the article previously by Sarah Ali, she writes a very poignant line, and she says, so a bomb, like a house with 12 members was bombed, but nobody was in the house. And she writes, my uncles and cousins received no phone call, no messages, nothing, and the house was bombed. Not that a phone call telling you we'll bomb your house makes it any better. And I think this line catches it, like, okay, so you received a message, yeah, but your house is gonna be bombed at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So does that make it any better? Yeah, like you'll of course survive or like take precautions to live, but does that do any better?
Well, we will answer that after a short break. When we return back, I think more discussion will be focusing more on the media war as well as the war on the ground.
Voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene,
This is Gowri.
And I'm Asmod.
and we are back again with our conversation on the Israeli and Palestine war, which is happening currently in the Gaza strips. So far, we have covered a part of the media war as well as what is happening on the ground right now. But I want to discuss more on what is happening in terms of the media war, because if you look at the media, I think the major news sources would be CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and some other prominent news like The Economist, The Times, and The Guardians and all that. But it seems like each of the media has their own stance on where they position themselves. And I think for us laymen, I think what the best way is to digest all media and make our own judgment on it. But maybe do you want to explain more, Gowri, like what is the current situation in terms of the media war?
I think it's pretty clear in a way that the Western countries tend to be more towards Israel, whereas over here, especially in Malaysia, we are more pro-Palestine.
But why is that so? Maybe Asmod can answer that. Why Western countries have been traditionally pro-Israeli in the matters of the war itself?
Maybe we can go all the way back to formation of, say, Israel and how it came into existence, right? So Israel was formed in like 48, and like some countries, like say even Palestine, doesn't like it so much hesitates to just recognize that Israel exists. and say there are many countries in the world which call Israel as like Zionist state or like it's interesting. Say I was talking with a friend and from Indonesia, and what he told was many people there are pro-Palestine, and they see Israel as advocate of devil. That's the rhetoric that the mass media put out against Israel in many countries.
And I think in many Islamic countries as well, or third world countries, Israel is seen as this iron feast that is consuming all.
I think I read an article just about
Palestine.
that yesterday, where in the school in Palestine, they actually in their syllabus they portray Israel as like the advocates of devil. They actually draw pictures of devil and say like, this is Israel and we need to be against these people.
But I think there's a danger to see things in black and white, especially to portray either of it as, you know, the devil or the bad guy. I think the complexity of the situation in Israel and Palestine is there's no two countries that are the devil or the bad guy. I think the war that is happening right now is not a religious war or the Jews against the Muslim. I mean, for me at least, what I see personally is more like the Zionist regime of the Israeli government against Hamas military. So who are the people of Israel and the people of Gaza is actually being caught in the middle of this war. I mean, the reason why I see this in this way, because you look at the neighbors in Palestine and Israel, none of them have been voicing out at all. In fact, Egyptians have
shut off their borders.
Shut off their borders. I mean, these are refugees that they could have brought in to Egypt and at least to save more lives, but they didn't do that. They choose to just sit there and then like do nothing.
And Israel is probably worth to mention that Israel is a non-Islamic state in a region where most of these states are Islamic, and they take one side against another. So there's a huge divide between Shia and Sunni, even within the Muslim world. And there are claims that Iran has been supporting Hamas for a long time, and the rockets that have been fired in Israel are coming from Iran. And we all, like many of us who are probably listening, are aware of the sanctions in Iran, its nuclear enrichment program, and its relationship with the Western countries.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you bring Iran in this picture, because Iran is the main sponsor of Hamas, which is quite interesting because considering in the politics of the Muslim world, which is either Shia or Sunni. So especially in Malaysia, it's like, oh, Shia is the devil, another devil, I guess. But then when you look back, Hamas is being sponsored by Iran, and we have like probably the biggest Iranian tourists in probably the region of Southeast Asia. So what are you talking about? The situation in Israeli is also another issue that we can discuss. People always say that, oh, Israel is a Jewish state, but they don't realize that it's actually a secular state. It's not based its ideological leaning on the religion, although in terms of Zionism, they are actually quite offensive in terms of the way they exert their security measure. Like they don't hesitate to bomb you if they think that you are a threat to their country. And for Israel, they actually have quite a huge minority of Muslims there. So that's one thing to consider as well.
And the location of Israel is very strategic, like it's next to sea, and it borders many countries like which are very, very volatile in the region. Say there's Jordan nearby, there's Syria, and lot has been going on in these countries. There's Iraq nearby, although it doesn't border Iraq directly, and there is Saudi Arabia, which is kind of stable more or less. Say Western countries, like many of them have bases in, at least US has bases in many of these countries, and many of these countries in this region have history of colonial power and colonial domination, so they still have some form of ties with the other countries. And maybe we can ask questions about security, like how secure do the countries feel themselves. I mean, like Iran might feel insecure against Israel, and there's Iraq, which has so much going on within its own country, but they also like threats from outside. Say recently ISIS, which has been dominating like many parts of Syria and Iraq. So the countries like have fear against each other, like so much going on within themselves, and there's this conflict. Like it seems like if one looks at Middle East today, the conflicts are what prominently, one can see in the map out there is so much like it seems all that is going on in the Middle East are conflicts in the region. So maybe like countries can put rhetorics about national security, politics, but we cannot, I think, negate the role that big powerhouses are playing here, and it largely depends on which sides are they taking.
Interesting.
But going back to what you said, the fact that Israel is a Jewish state and Palestine has more Muslims in there, wouldn't it make more sense for the surrounding Arab countries to actually react instead of being silent?
Interestingly, the history of the existence of Israel is not something that we want to have it that in the area. Okay, that's it. Like it has in the past, the surrounding Arab countries actually were not happy with that, and there were a number of wars happening.
Yeah, that's why, as far as I'm concerned, they actually did attack
Yeah.
Israel
In the past. Maybe I can give a summary of what kind of war that happened between Israel and its neighbors. Of course, the first one is the 1984 Palestine War, which lasted for 6 months. It started as a 6 months of civil war between the between the Palestinians and also the between the Jewish and Arab militias, which is at the end of British Mandate of Palestine, and turned into a regular war after the declaration of independence of Israel and the intervention of several Arab armies. So it's true that they intervened. Countries, but at the end of the day, they signed an agreement between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and called for the 1948 Armistice Agreement, which established the Armistice Alliance between the Israel and its neighbors, also known as the Green Light. So that's where the borders of Israel was formed. But during the 60s and 50s, there was a reprisal operation, which somehow having the Arab guerrillas from Syria, Egypt, and Jordan to infiltrate into Israel and carry out attacks. But subsequently, there's also the Suez crisis, which is between Israel and also Egypt, and later on the Six-Day War, which is actually quite an infamous war, happened in 1967, fought between Israel and its Arab neighbors, which is Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and together with Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Algeria, also contributed towards the troop. And let me just scan through other wars. War of Attrition in 1967 to 1970, Yom Kippur War, 1973, and also Palestinian insurgency in South Lebanon, 1982 Lebanon War, which is actually a very, very famous war that one of our Malaysian doctor went there to witness, and she wrote a book, From Lebanon to Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very heartbreaking book that I think every Malaysian should read. Her humanitarian work there and the experience that she faced when she went all the way from Lebanon refugee camp, the Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, down to Jerusalem to give her testimony on what she witnessed there. And of course, the other wars, the First Intifada War, the Second Intifada War, the 2006 Lebanon War, and the Gaza War happened in 2008, between 2009, and many more. So the war has been like happening quite frequently, and it's in like in a short amount of time. But majority of the time is always like between Israel and its neighbors. But later on, like probably after the Lebanon War, I think Arab countries has probably grown tired about it. I'm not sure, but majority of the war after 1982's Lebanon war, it only involved Palestinians and Israeli.
And getting back to your question, like why aren't the countries in Middle East necessarily speaking about being vocal about this military invasion of Gaza? Say, it might be interesting to look at the U.S. military presence in Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
So it has like military bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt. So almost like in many of the countries in Middle East, it has military presence and military interest. And needless to say, like Israel is one of the, it has strong ties with Israel. Say, and if US and Western countries are taking one side in the war, although they might, support or like have some, they might support Gaza, maybe like on humanitarian basis, but seeing their national interest, it might not be worth for the country just to speak up something and try to maintain ties with the countries that they need to, given the oil that they need to. So there are many like economic interests now which many countries cannot negate. It's not just like, and they know this war is not gonna be decided by this war or maybe a couple years down the road. And like I just looking at the population makeup, say just like two countries in the Middle East, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the population divide is there. Like say even in terms of religion, although they both are majority Islam, say Saudi it has majority Sunni, and Iran it has majority Shia, and they are very strongly divided. So on Iran on one hand supports Hamas, but Saudi, although it might not support Hamas, but also like because Iran is supporting Hamas, it might not directly support Hamas in that sense.
So it's another sort of like partisan war based on like who support who.
Maybe it might filter down to like it might be one of the reasons. It's not, if not the strongest reason. Yeah.
What do you think, Gowri?
Actually, I want to talk about the solutions that have been brought up by
very
few
good,
of the.
very good suggestion. So, what are the solutions?
I guess the most obvious and the most popular one is, of course, the two-state solution. And I have a quote here from Obama, who said that as much as the Israeli people have the right to live in their historic homeland of the Jewish people, the Palestinians also have a right to self-determination. So the only obvious solution here is to commit to a two-state solution and security cooperation with Israel. But for me, I don't know how plausible is that, considering the fact that these two countries have been at loggerheads for the longest time.
Yeah, especially
like
the illegal
said,
settlement, happening in some parts of Gaza.
So like the Palestinians would feel like, why should we probably submit to this solution when it wasn't their country in the first place? We are living here.
It's interesting that you highlighted that, because what I read is Hamas at one point were agreeing with that two-state solution, but now I don't think so. I think they see Israel as the clear enemy. I don't think they would agree in the time being on the two-state solution. What do you think, Asmod? Do you think we should go forward towards this two-state solution, or should the Palestinian insist on having to reclaim back, their own country, which is situated in Israel right now?
I think it's a very complex issue. Say Hamas won the election in 2006, and if people are to say, hey, like if elections happen in democracy and people are to respect the election result, then Hamas is a kind of legitimate body to represent the people in Gaza. So what's it say? Like, and it fired, it has been shelling Israel. So it might not just like say like who wants what, right? But actually say, and it's not just what the countries want. It's like what the Western world wants, what the other countries in the Middle East want. So I think rather like it would be much better like if they can come to some form of truce. But it seems like the only solution right now, or at least for the time being, is to agree on some form of ceasefire and carry diplomatic talks.
I think that was being spoken by Obama as well. I think the first thing to do is to do the ceasefire first, then to talk. What was the next step forward?
Because whether they agree or not, yeah, they might, win the war militarily and based on military prowess. But at the end of the day, I don't know for how long a country can dominate other country simply based on power itself or like forced military power. So diplomatic solutions, I don't know what the results are gonna be. Will be probably a highly feasible solution to both countries.
So Arlene, if you were Palestine, considering all your historical background, would you recognize Israel as a Jewish state?
Well, Malaysia doesn't recognize Israel as as a legitimate state. But we also have to look at the bigger picture here. I think the bigger picture here is both the Jews and the Muslim want to live in peace. And I think what they should look at in the long term is to create this bridge between the Jewish people and the Jewish people and the Muslims. And I think if I'm being given sort of like the vision for what is happening there, I would prefer to have a one-state solution. But instead of having Zionism as the ideology or Islamic terrorism as the ideology, I would rather have like a democracy where people just learn to live with each other, like what happened before the 1948 war, before the formation of Israeli government. So with that, I think at the end of the day, what is important is how can we live together in peace. It may take time. It may take probably a few more decades to achieve that. But if there's no like starting point towards it, I don't think we would be able to achieve peace in the Middle East. So I guess with that, that's all for today in our conversation. I think it's such an interesting conversation. I wish it can go on a bit more longer. But we hope that whatever that is happening in Gaza right now, there should be like a clear ceasefire and a solution towards peace rather than continue fighting between the Zionist government of Israel as well as the Hamas terrorist group. Anyway, thank you. This is Arlene signing off.
This is Gowri.
Thanks so much for listening. I'm Asmod.